All right, welcome. We're talking about war today. We're going to move from some of the earlier discussions we've had about about boys and their coalitional kind of behavior and how it looks like they're getting ready for war, to talk about war a little more directly and try to understand it as a way of protecting or advancing reproductive fitness. So there's a bit of a paradox here that we'll talk about. War is very destructive and very costly, so there's a paradox in how evolution would let it exist and persist. So we will dive into that. Okay, so some key concepts from the reading that I think would be helpful to get out. So what your author is dealing with is why our males especially appear to be prepared for war. There's this paradox in that war is very dangerous. Obviously, a lot of people die. Why is that not eliminated by evolution? And his solution, thinking as a good evolutionist, is that there must be some ways in which war produces more reproductive fitness, at least for some, than if there were no causes for war. So Gatzett is advancing what he calls the integrated motivational complex, and what he's trying to do is rule out simpler, what he might call like monocausal factors, single things that could cause war, like hunger or deprivation or fear or a lust for power. He's saying all those kind of things are refracted, and there's an imminent, deeper principle that has to do with reproductive fitness. So he's thinking about this, or we can think about it at least from a game theory perspective, and thinking about reproduction as a game and what kind of moves could ultimately increase a gene's reproductive fitness. So all the causes that we think about, somehow they must cash out in terms of reproductive fitness if you want to understand war as something that's evolved. And given its prevalence and how long it's been around, it seems like that's a good bet. Some other terminology that he uses is he distinguishes between somatic causes and reproductive fitness causes. So somatic has to do with the body, and that just means those are the kinds of things that the body needs to do in order to survive. So if you're starving to death and you attack somebody else and take their food, well, that's a somatic kind of cause. But he also points out that there's many ways in which there's these deeper reproductive drives. So it's not as if humans are necessarily thinking, I gotta have more offspring. But the gene in some way has been reinforced for that over the years and honed and refined to seek that. So he'll talk about some primary ways in which that happens. Polygyny is being a marital strategy that enhances a male's reproductive fitness, or going to war in order to secure more women. And then there's some secondary reasons as well that relate to things like dominance seeking and the security dilemma, kin cooperation. These are what I would call emergent properties of more complex systems that then take on some drivers of their own. Okay, so to conceptualize the integrated motivational complex that Gatt talks about, I'm going to draw on a nice diagram that Gottschall has in Status Warriors. And one of the things, he calls this is in a chapter called Status Warriors, and he's trying to relate status seeking to reproductive fitness concerns and war, and also efforts to secure more women and more resources. So he writes the book, The Rape of Troy, which we'll read in a few weeks here. Okay, so one of the key things about this is he says it's non-hierarchical. So in other words, it's not as if first and foremost wars start over women, and it's not as if first and foremost they start over resources or status. That instead there's this latent factor that's behind the scenes driving stuff, and it's that logic of reproductive success. And then if that's the driver, it shows up that women, resources, and status are all things that enable you to advance that reproductive success. And so we can think about it as the latent factor behind these more specific drives. And it's not as if the three things on the outside are convertible to one another, but there's definitely relationships. So for example, if you have more resources, you might attract more women or be able to support more offspring. We'll talk about some of those interconnections in a minute. One little note here I have up in the corner is, but where's the independent and dependent variable? I'd suggest that we're at a point where there's some limits to that kind of heuristic of causality, where there's one independent variable affecting other independent variables. Because in this model, we're saying you can have an emphasis on this, and an emphasis on this, and an emphasis on this, and they all kind of reflect the reproductive success. But we can't say that, for example, it's ultimately the pursuit of women that leads to war. And we can't measure reproductive success or reproductive fitness seeking directly, so we can't put that in an experiment and see how it relates to war. So we can test pieces of this model, but at some level, there's just a testing of a certain way of thinking and seeing if it works better than the alternatives. Okay, so one way to understand somebody is to understand who they're arguing against. And Gatt is arguing as an anthropologist, and there's this long-running anthropology debate about war. There's different facets of it. One facet is that people are not necessarily warlike, and it's only accidents that cause war. Or people are not necessarily warlike, and it's only after they're colonized and dominated by Western powers that they start experimenting with these kind of large-scale violence. Well, this particular debate that he's really focused on here in this chapter is he's arguing with this guy named Ferguson that says war is only about material causes. This is a very Marxist perspective where everything comes down to material goods. Everything's about money and the stuff money can buy. And Gatt is saying, not really. Resources are important. That's part of the model that Gatt presents. But you can't explain war without considering the relationship between war and women and how men are, in the ancestral environment at least, seeking to obtain women or access to women or competing over women. And you can't tease out this role of status in terms of driving these dynamics as well. So the status in the women, for example, they don't fit in this Marxist model. And it's the argument that Gatt is presenting is that just focusing on resources is too narrow and misses the reproductive logic of this. And then just again to suggest how these things interact, if you have more resources, that means you might be able to get a higher rank, higher status. And if you have higher status, you might be able to attract or support more women. Or if you have more resources, you might be able to feed more dependents or more offspring. So these outer things, they all are in some essence convertible, or at least having some of them helps you get the other ones. Okay, so some examples of how the material, so like just the fact of how much money do I have, and the reproduction drivers interacting. So this is a recent study, but you're looking at some historians from a revolutionary perspective. This is in the premier Evolutionary Psych Journal. But they're arguing that what happened with the Vikings, the reasons they took up this kind of raiding was that there was a shortage of women. And what you had going on is you had polygyny, so certain men marrying more than one woman, and you had concubinage, which means like a man having more than one woman. He might not be married to them, but you can have like concubine slaves. But anyway, one man is taking up more space than just one wife. And that creates this social inequality. And so the logic and the evidence suggests that what happened is you had this pool of unmarried men that were motivated to engage in these risky behavior of going out and raiding, going out and doing the Viking thing. And what they were trying to do is get enough status and wealth that they could enter the marriage market and get a spouse. So it's hard to understand this as just all they wanted was a wife. or all they wanted was money, those two things were interacting as the evolutionary model suggests. Okay, and then also later on they went on to found a football franchise, but that's a different story. All right, so very similar dynamic in a very different part of the world, very different climate, all that kind of stuff. These guys don't wear funny hats. But if you look at the society practice of bride price that you'll see in some countries in Africa, and cattle stealing. So what's going on here? Well, to get a woman, some societies, you have to pay a bride price, and it's paid to the woman's family. So to raise money to pay that, what young men will do will go out and steal cattle, and it causes all kinds of violence and bloodshed. So you see a guy here, he's either protecting his cattle or getting ready to steal somebody else's. So, and within this system, there's this tendency for very young brides being married off to older men that are wealthier, and lots of young men are left without wives. And as you might suggest, or you might figure, young men without wives are a dangerous thing, right? Because that motivates a certain kind of risk-taking that can lead to violence and conflict and war. So, we'll talk about this at another point in the course, but the whole idea of monogamy is this societal transformation that makes societies a lot less violent, because if every man can have access to a woman and be able to have children, then that man has a stake in the future. He's not going to throw it all away and go to war and try to steal somebody else's cattle. So many evolutionists and thinkers will talk about the evolution of human monogamy as this advance that really created a lot more peaceful societies. But we have a variety, obviously, in our tradition of how we do things. But once you have status hierarchies, it gets tricky trying to prevent violence. Okay, so what's going on? So GATT runs through a number of causes, or a number of factors that related to evolutionary drivers that produce war. So one of the first ones he starts with, which is probably the most obvious, but it's this idea of resource competition. Under certain situations, if your back is against the wall, you and your people might use violence to get the kinds of resources you need to survive. So one thing we need to understand about this is the way humans and other species are shaped by evolution to overproduce, okay? So humans and all species are designed to push the limits. In other words, if there is a certain space in an environment, the reproduction will occur until you fill that space and consume all those resources. And if you think about it, the reason why you have to have that is that every point in a species trajectory, there's going to be times where there's some kind of calamity and a huge number of them get killed off. Well, in order to bounce back from that, you have to imagine that they can produce at some positive rate, where there's a gain where they have more offspring than there were parents. So the joke is rabbits are a classic case of this. Rabbits will quickly fill up an environment. Rabbits reproduce very quickly. So I have some rabbits talking here like, I can out-reproduce these losers any day. And this one says, I'll be like Abraham, filling the forest with my children, and their children, and their children's children. So in other words, any species can exceed the carrying capacity of its environment. So you get this resource squeeze is one thing that happens, where the population increases, and then if for some reason the resources decrease, say you overfish the fishery or there's a drought, then you get this competition that comes on. So at some point, and also GATT points out that you can move, but at some point all the viable territory is taken up by this over-reproduction function or dynamic. And so you either have to defend your territory against somebody else that's starving and trying to come and take yours, or you might end up trying to kill off somebody else to take their territory. But the logic is that the resource space fills up and then there's competition for it. Okay, there's also the opposite effect, and this is somewhat counterintuitive, but you can get a lot of violence if you have a pile of resources in one place, as long as they are defensible. So the logic they've found, as long as you have a defensible resource, you get these power hierarchies. So if you think about a fishery, you have enough resources that some people don't have to engage in the actual production, and they can kind of supervise the production, and then you get these more complex societies, you get wealth and resource competition and all that kind of stuff. So the classic case in America is if you look at the Northwest tribes along Northwest America and into Canada, what I think the Canadians call the First Peoples. They are phenomenally rich, strong, and polygynous. So you will have this phenomenon where females are taken in raids, and you'll have rich people that have these things we'll talk about in a minute here, but are called potlatches, where they try to compete and show that they can give away more of their resources. But once you have defensible resources, you have a great amount of competition over that, and hence war and raiding can take hold. So just talking about resources, this is an artistic kind of representation of a whale, which is one of the resources in that rich environment. Okay, so those were the somatic drivers, right? Those are the ones that just first order, are we going to survive or not? But then you also have these reproductive drivers that kick in. So if you remember parental investment theory, that's telling you that at some point the real only limit on males is access to females. And what that boils down to is it's male competition over who's going to have access to females. So we see this in different kinds of species. Here's some deer are competing for access to females. Actually, this guy lost his keys, and this guy's trying to help him find the keys. And then the keys are here, but by this point, the antlers are all interlocked, and so they're going to have to call an antler smith, and he'll come in and cut this so they can get disentangled. All right, so anyway, you got a lot of violence occurring over women. So within groups, you have conflicts, wife stealing and murders that come about. Intergroup, you have these raiding that goes on. You have some dark stuff, some rape, concubine, slaves, marriage in quotes, because it's not kind of the marriage that we think about, but you would have women and men brought together in different kinds of results from raids. So in the Gatt talks about some research with the Eskimos that female abduction was a principal cause of war, and also if somebody came to town with his wife, that stranger was at risk of being killed because somebody could kill him and then take his wife. So one thing to think about here is there's this tendency to kind of have this warm, hazy glow or gauze that we put on different kinds of indigenous peoples. But there was, in hunter-gatherer communities, like there was a certain level of violence that's very different. Even in the most peaceful hunter-gatherer societies, it was far more violent than what you would see in the most violent urban inner cities today. Okay, so this is a fascinating example that helps us understand the connection between war and reproductive fitness. So after you had agriculture established in the Neolithic Revolution, then you had these pockets of resources that would become really attractive for raiding. And so once you had the dawn of agriculture, you had the dawn of empires. And this is a map showing the full extent of Genghis Khan's empire. So Genghis Khan was this Mongolian ruler who united different Mongolian tribes, and then they went out and conquered a good part of the known world. And that was the physical war part of it. But you see here, this is some of the ideology. This is a quote from Genghis Khan talking about why he did this or what motivated him. He said, "The greatest joy for a man is to defeat his enemies, to drive them before him, to take them from all that possess, to see those they love in tears, to ride their horses, and to hold their wives and daughters in his arms." So this is a little bit cleaned up version, but Genghis is imagining having relationships with a variety of women, to put it euphemistically. So there's evidence that in fact happened. So if you look at research on DNA, there's evidence that 1 in every 200 men alive today are a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. And this map here shows the percentage of people in a population that has a special star cluster chromosome that's the marker that it came from Genghis Khan. So you can see that there's a mapping of the extent of the empire and the markers, genetic markers of descending from Genghis Khan. So the short story here is this is dark, but war works as a way to increase your reproductive fitness, at least in some cases. Okay, so some more on the dynamics of reproduction in hunter-gatherer societies. So we mentioned earlier there are a lot of violent deaths. When they are looking at fossilized burial grounds and examining the remains from hunter-gatherer times, there's oftentimes findings where many of the men, 30%, sometimes higher, 50%, have died some kind of violent death, where they have broken skulls or arrows embedded in their body. So there's a suggestion that a lot of indigenous people, so to speak, in hunter-gatherer societies died violent deaths. So they find this with, for example, Aboriginals in Australia and the Plains Indians in the United States, or what became the United States. Okay, and then there's this evidence that once you get more resources, we talked about this before, you get greater wealth disparities, and then you get this monopolization of resources, like polygyny. And once you have young adult males that are deprived of resources, of a chance to marry and have access to a woman, they get belligerent and desperate. So think the Vikings or think the cattle raiding. So you find this polygyny in many hunter-gatherer societies. And there's, especially in rich areas, 10 to 12 wives for a wealthy man. And Gatt talks about a particular guy, Shinbone's father, who ultimately had 401 great-grandchildren. So you can think about it, if you're one guy and you eventually have 400 plus grandkids in later generations, that's a pretty effective reproductive strategy. And so if there is some way in which war contributed to you to getting these resources, or to having that wealth to be able to support that many wives and grandkids, then there's selective pressures pushing the gene towards adopting that strategy. Kinship is also really important in these hunter-gatherer societies. You would have within a certain group, the largest clans, that is the largest family lineages, would come to dominate and control leadership, and then you get this emergence of chiefs. And once you have chiefs, you have more capacity for organizing and for war between groups. But the short story is there's a feedback loop where the more offspring you have, eventually the more power you have, and the more power you have, the more resources you have, so the more offspring can you have. So this is what systems theorists call a success to the successful, where there's a feedback loop that the more resources you have, the greater the imbalances, which allow you to get more resources. So some key points: competition over resources definitely connects to reproductive fitness, and reproductive fitness looks like a root cause. So we're referencing his integrated motivational complex again. Okay, then there's some secondary causes that he talks about that are not directly related to reproductive fitness, but these are kind of games that arise because of that. So there's oftentimes a competition for dominance, because if you're dominant, if you have a higher status, you have access to more resources and you have more reproductive success. So there's these contacts for rank, power, status, and whatever that can lead to violence. So even if basic needs are being met, there's still a competition for high status goods that make you stand out. And you get competition in gift giving. So this is that potlatch ceremony that I talked about, where different chiefs try to compete for status by giving more gifts, and if they get more status, they can get more wives, etc. And we already talked about bride price and cattle stealing. You have a phenomenon where people will fight to protect their honor. So when there's no centralized authority, if one group doesn't avenge an attack by another group, you are at risk of being a punching bag from that point forward. So the proximate cause might be that you get angry at somebody from taking resources from you. So, for example, somebody's sleeping with your wife, you're enraged. But the ultimate cause is there's some kind of drive to protect reproductive resources. You look at certain things like jealousy, and you can understand how, from an evolutionary standpoint, they are adaptive. So those are some secondary causes. A second set, he mentioned at least two other things I want to talk about here. One, the security dilemma. This is a nasty problem that occurs across time in different cultures. But the problem is that if you're threatened by if there's somebody else out there that could be a potential enemy, that you recognize that they may suddenly attack you without warning. And so what you think you need to do is develop some resources. So you develop some defensive capabilities. Well, the other group sees you developing defensive resources, and so they start developing defensive resources, and before you know it, you have an arms race. So each side might be authentically pursuing just defense, but it doesn't take long to have the kind of escalation of war-making materials that can lead to warfare. So warfare, in essence, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I have here, like, this is the old Soviet Union, and they have a parade where they're showing off all their missiles that they could launch at the great Satan, the United States. Or here's another, people are talking about China and the U.S. getting into another arms race, and maybe about technology or surveillance. So the problem is almost all war can be justified as defensive. You also have this dynamic where people are committed to their kin, and if their kin get into arguments that become deadly, they can get dragged into the conflict. So there's that inclusive fitness logic which drives you to support your kin, and once kin are in conflict, it draws in other people, and written more broadly, you get this shared cultural identity as a kinship marker. So here I have, like, Uncle Sam, right? Your uncle, get it? There's a reproductive relationship there, is saying, I want you in the army. Like, we as a nation are at war. We as this larger family are at war. You need to do your part to support us. And in World War II, you had Hitler famously talking about the fatherland and the Aryan race that was in competition with other races. And you had Stalin that was talking about the motherland and motivating people to make sacrifices for that. So it's not as if all these groups are kinships, but they can use the language of kinship and the logic of kinship to say it's us against them, and that can be a huge motivator for war. So basically, what's going on is you get with the strong kinship identification, which you might call in some circles nationalism, right? Or white nationalism, or whatever you want to call it. But you get a certain kind of ethnocentrism that can lead to war. Okay, so some key conclusions here. So first off, there's a good bit of evidence that we are prepared for at least male coalitional aggression. That's not to say that violence is this drive that we have to satisfy, but Gatz is arguing that we have these highly tuned, evolutionary shaped tactics. So if you think back to Benson, and when she was talking about the way boys engage in play and how they make up rules and how they figure out how to act together and how they make it so they can get bigger and bigger coalitions brought together, you can see all that stuff is a training ground for getting ready for this larger scale coalitional aggression. And the key point that Gatz is making here, that you can look at different particular causes that in a given conflict you might say, well, they were fighting about the water, or they were jealous of this group's resources, or there was just vanity, or whatever. But he's saying all that stuff can't explain it, that you need reproductive fitness to make all that stuff hang together and to integrate all those potential causes. So reproductive fitness becomes this deeper and what he calls this immanent principle. And this is an important term. So let me contrast immanent with transcendent. So transcendent means there's something outside of space and time that's working its way, or maybe working its will in the world. So like some kind of divine being or some kind of larger thing that's behind the scenes that's influencing what's going on. He's suggesting that evolution is this immanent principle that just it lies behind all these different other things we see, and it's if you scratch through all the other muck, you could eventually get to this deeper principle that it's immanent. It's within the world itself that it's coming out and being revealed as a deeper structure. So what he's talking about here again is these different disparate causes getting organized, and he's disputing the ideal that it's only about money. And this might seem like a stretch, but there's many economists, and economists have a lot of stature to define the world in terms of economic systems. But Gatz and other people would say that they are missing something, that money is not the ultimate driver of everything. It's important, resources are important, but it's at the root, it's reproductive fitness, and you have to understand that. So, and he then suggests, he reminds us that if you're looking for some non-transcendent mechanism, so there's not something outside in space and time that's pulling levers, then the best mechanism we have for explaining complexity is evolution. So just two other quick asides here. I'm gonna have you watch some videos that talk about the evidence that our close cousin chimpanzees also engage in this kind of coalitional aggression, suggesting that it's part of our behavioral repertoire that we have inherited along with other primates. And I also wanted to just point out that in terms of looking for these deeper immanent principles, we saw Benenson doing that in what I think is a pretty masterful work, where she looks across a wide range of studies and different kinds of patterns of behaviors and narratives and all kinds of things. And she says there's something about men that's coalitional. There's something about boys that want to come together and make these groups, and they're more interested in groups than in playing alone, and they get this great joy out of interacting together. And she's saying that's what's at root of being a boy. And she's saying when you look at women, there's this strategic vigilance, there's this protective instinct to be able to execute these long-term projects where they invest in some offspring for 9 months and then for the rest of that offspring's life. So women are amazing in terms of their ability to stay focused on a few offspring and make sure those offsprings have the best possible outcomes. So those are immanent principles related to these different typical expressions of gender, and then those are reflecting this deeper immanent principle of reproductive fitness. So it's kind of like peeling layers of an onion and seeing how they're connected. So I just want to close with a quote that was from one of my favorite evolutionists, anthropologists, great thinkers, Gregory Bateson. And he described a lot of his work as searching for the pattern that connects. And he was a big fan of evolutionary theory and a big fan of understanding that which is immanent. And he thought that the principles of evolution were the things that made stuff hold together. And so there's certain ways that shows up that are kind of fun to look at. So there's this idea of homology, where you're looking across different kinds of species and you can find certain parallels that are really weird. So the bat and the horse look like they are very different kinds of creatures on the surface. But when you look under the hood, you see that they have the same basic relationship among their bone structures. In other words, the same patterns are connected here, and it's just that the individual bones take on different shapes and are stretched in different ways over millions of years. But that at the end of the day, we can tell that all of these species come back to a common ancestor. And so there's this when we look across the world, when you look across the bone structure of different animals, or when you look across the ways that boys are different from girls, or when you look across why do humans engage in this really destructive pattern of violence we call war, all those things point to this deeper principle of evolution that's immanent, that's tied into the very essence of the way life works. And the suggestion is, or the tantalizing possibility, is the extent to which we can better understand how that evolution works, we can have a lot of leverage and purchase and control over its expression in all kinds of ways. So that hopefully, just to be idealistic here, if we can kind of understand the forces that ultimately are causing war, we can work towards creating a world where those forces don't dominate us, and that we don't have to have this unbearable suffering that war brings. So looking honestly at something and trying to see how it's potentially beneficial for a lineage opens up possibilities for changing that the influence of that thing, such that we can make a better world where we have less war and more of the good stuff. So, all right, thank you for listening.